in terms of leadership, the people that we look at who become our leaders, are they more likely to be narcissists?
Narcissistic people naturally turn to leadership. I mean, they want to be in charge, right? A lot of actually sane people will take the position of, I don't want to be a leader. Like I'm kind of content where I am at. I'm good. But the wanting to be a leader, and the tricky bit with narcissistic people is they want to be the leader, but they don't want to do they don't want to actually attend in an empathic, healthy way to the role of leadership. It's basically, how can I make myself bigger? So that's why when narcissistic people get into leadership, it can ultimately be a little bit of a problem, or a big bit of a problem, because it's still all about them. And so the decisions they make are not necessarily going to benefit the people they lead, but rather they're going to do whatever they can do to keep getting validation as a leader. So throughout history, I can't say this is a new phenomenon. Your history books are full of the narcissists. In fact, we don't hear about ordinary people from history because they didn't do the things that would make history, right? And so they absolutely are drawn to leadership. They are overrepresented in leadership, and they want to be in charge. It's very much the power, control, domination, motivation of a narcissistic person is very much, you see it in their wanting to be leaders.
Well, that's a recipe for disaster too. I mean,
absolutely.
Our country being led by narcissists and having access to nuclear codes sounds like a horrible
any country thing. And I think that what happens is that because narcissistic leaders are so often charismatic, right? They draw attention, and people in them see. It's really interesting to watch how people imprint on a narcissistic leader. And because narcissistic people are so seemingly confident, even despite all that insecurity, they sort of have this sort of carnival barker kind of confidence. Come on in, you'll never have seen anything like this before. This is the greatest show on earth, and kind of believe it. It's almost delusional, where the rest of us might be like, I'll show you this. I don't know how good it is. But they have that big confidence, and they can really, and they know how to read a room. Narcissistic people are also very socially perceptive. That's why they're great salespeople. So you combine that sort of salesiness that they have, the lack of empathy, the entitlement, the need to be the one in power, control, and domination. You can see how they can trick an entire group of people, whether in a company, whether in a country, whether in a state, whether in a town. It doesn't matter. And it is amazing how malleable people are in the hands of a narcissistic person. Look at all the cults that have been out there. The people can really get them in this way. They're very, very convincing. They have a lot of conviction in a strange way. And so they're great at selling a point of view that benefits them.
And that's why we're so drawn to them.
We are drawn to them. And it's unfortunate. It's almost like, how do I teach people to be scared of charm and charisma?
You can't. You can't.
I mean, you have to gone through it, and you're like, okay, charming people scare me. I'm not drawn to charming charisma. I'll tell you, when I meet charming and charismatic people, I'm like, I'm going to just move my seat. Or it was real nice to meet you. I got to go. I find it aversive because I know where it's likely going to go. And I'm sure I've probably missed out on meeting some lovely, charming, charismatic people, but I'm willing to take the risk to avoid the possibility.
That is so interesting because I can think of so many people. But the other thing I think about this that we don't talk about enough, or people don't talk, they always talk about relationships with narcissistic people, but what about being friends? Like, just not a romantic relationship, but even having close friends that are narcissistic can have a huge impact on your day-to-day.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, narcissistic friends, we actually don't talk about it enough. Friendships are very powerful social spaces for us, especially for people who are not already in committed relationships. And I think younger people are turning to friends as very significant social players in their lives, whereas in prior generations, it really became about the intimate partner. And because of that, friends are also very influential developmentally. Younger people tend to rely more on friendships as a social kind of connection, maybe than do older folks. And if they're younger, emerging adulthood, that's also going to affect sort of their social and emotional development. But all of that said, narcissistic friends, in some ways, it can be a very similar process. The tricky bit is that sometimes we meet friends when we're very young, right? Personality continues to develop till about 25, and then it kind of gets a little bit more cemented. Someone we met new in high school, right? A lot of our sort of adolescent silliness, we thought, oh, that's just adolescent silliness. And we get older and older, and perhaps they get more and more selfish, but there can be a nostalgic link to the early origins of that friendship. But narcissistic friendships can be very harmful. It can really lead to big betrayals of trust, lots of loss of trust in self. And sometimes people feel really foolish that they've been played by a friend. It's almost like we get it when it's an intimate relationship, but not as much when it's a friendship. And yet the harms of narcissistic friendship can be experienced at the same level as the harm of any other narcissistic relationship.
Is it much harder, you think, for people to disconnect from a narcissistic friendship that they've had for like since childhood than it is to maybe disconnect with an intimate partner they've had for a few months?
Yes, I would actually say that yes. If it's only been a few months with the intimate partner and they're still also struggling with a narcissistic friend they've known since they were a little kid, absolutely. It has almost a familial vibe at that point, right? Somebody who's watched you grow up, where there's a sense of loyalty, where there's a sense of history. The reason long-term relationships, no matter how toxic they become, are difficult to let go of is we need shared historians in our lives. That's how our brains develop, right? And so without that, we can feel as though we almost doubt ourselves, like, what's wrong with me? I'm cutting people out. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I can't get along with people. And the more we self-blame, the less we're able to clearly see that other person's behavior. But the fact of the matter is friendships, like all relationships, sometimes don't suit every season of our lives. And that there are some friendships that we grow away from for any number of reasons. Sometimes one friend has kids and the other one doesn't, and that takes you to very different places. But when it's a friend who's behaving in an antagonistic, toxic, invalidating way, we often don't think about. We think about that a lot when it comes to partners, right? We don't think of friends as cheating on us and that kind of thing. But it matters. It matters a lot.
Yeah, and then I could see that pattern would be harder to pick up because it's going to fluctuate and you don't see them every day. So it may be years before you realize you're in a narcissistic relationship with your close friend.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. For some people, it can take a lifetime because remember, our exposure to friendship is different too. Unless it's a roommate situation or something like that, we often don't have the 24/7 exposure we might have to an intimate partner. Tensions manifest differently in an intimate relationship. There's different demands around equitability and sharing of responsibilities, chores, child rearing. All of those become more nodes of tension where a friendship may not always get tested the same way. In fact, I think a narcissistic roommate relationship would get tested a lot more quickly than a narcissistic friendship would. So because of that the friendship, it doesn't get the same amount of they're not in your life in the same way. In a way, a friendship, this can get dragged out for a very, 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 very long time.
Yeah, that's tough. And then I guess the hardest relationship to get rid of would be with a narcissistic parent.
Oh, yeah. Well, the narcissistic parent, that's the most complicated relationship of all because the parent's narcissism ultimately shaped your own psychology, right? So narcissistic parents are not healthy parents. They do a lot of harm to their kids in the sense of it could be downright child abuse in some cases, but it can also really be creating an atmosphere of tremendous adversity in the sense of the child is basically, it's a role reversal. The child is expected to be meeting their parents' needs, whatever they are, in terms of not being seen, not being heard, doing the things that the parent expects them to, anticipating their parents' needs, being quiet when the parent wants them quiet, being cheerful when the parent wants them cheerful. The child doesn't get to have a separate emotional state. The parent will say, "What are you so sad about? You have a great life." And the child's sad and the child doesn't get to have that. Guilt is often used by narcissistic parents. They'll often shame the child's needs. If the child makes a need or a want known, "You're greedy, you're selfish, you're needy, you take advantage of me." And those are the kinds of things that will happen repeatedly. When kids have a narcissistic parent, they walk on eggshells. Because remember, the child needs the parent. It's not like an intimate partner. We don't need an intimate partner. As painful as it might be to end a relationship, we are fully formed adults. The child has no choice. And that attachment need, that survival attachment need means they got to figure it out. And the figuring out usually means the child negating their sense of self, negating their own needs, devaluing themselves, and viewing themselves as the problem. In essence, blaming themselves and rendering themselves almost unseeing of everything bad that's happening. Because if they see it, it's calamitous, right? That means this person who's supposed to care for me doesn't, and then what? So the child will construct a narrative where the parent is a decent, loving human being. Well, since they're not, all that has to go somewhere, and the child internalizes that.
Gosh, that's so hard. I guess any advice for any young adults who are finally figuring it out, or maybe teenagers who still are, reliant on their parents financially, and for home and food and all those things, how can they kind of survive in that in that circumstance?
It's tough. I mean, I think it's harder for adolescents who are still, it's such a tough time of life developmentally, right? Because the adolescent themselves is trying to individuate from the parent. That's a healthy thing for an adolescent to do. The narcissistic parent is then losing control of the child. Some narcissistic parents manipulate the child. How could you leave me? How can, you're so selfish, that kind of thing. So the child feels sort of stunted in their capacity to sort of grow and evolve away from the parent. Some adolescents rebel terribly against these parents to their own detriment. While the rebellion makes all the sense in the world, the rebellion may be self-defeating. The child may getting with the wrong peers, drugs, alcohol, but it's almost like I'll show you, I could be my own person, but it's not in a well-regulated way because they didn't really get to develop that having had this parent. I think above all else, what I'm going to say to anyone, but certainly even a young person who's managing a narcissistic parent is, this is not your fault. The best you can do is say this was a bit of bad luck. This is the parent you pulled out of the grand sort of, karmic abacus that's in the sky, and this is the thing you got stuck with. And so it's bad luck. I tell them, it's like, I know that's a weird way to put it, but that you got a parent or parents who are not up to the task. The other thing I do tell young people, though, is, listen, you just need one healthy parent and you'll be okay. That's one thing we do know. It's like you can fly a plane on one engine sometimes. You just need one healthy parent. And so cultivate that health. If you have that, where it gets really tricky is when one parent is very narcissistically abusive, the other parent is sort of stuck in this horrible, invalidating cycle with them, and often not as available to the kids as they need to be because they're in their own amount of grief and distress and despair over being in this terrible marriage. So the kid there might actually obviously fear or be angry or whatever they feel about the narcissistic parent, but it's negative. Then they have this other parent that they pity, but they're also angry at for not protecting them. So you can see how complicated that this can get. And, it's hard. It's hard for adolescents to think of, can I seek out therapy? Not all school counselors are equipped to hear this. More and more are every day, but to say, this is really toxic. But then even then, the best you can do is sometimes white knuckle it to get out of that circumstance. In young adulthood, maybe giving yourself more and more permission to distance yourself from that family of origin, but sometimes people feel a real sense of guilt of abandoning the other parent in that there's no easy fix here.